Welcome to Proof Points, a podcast by Latham High-Tech Seeds. Family-owned and farm-proven for more than 75 years, Latham Seeds is growing strong. Now, here's product manager and host of Proof Points, Steve Sick.
Well, today on Proof Points, everyone, I am here with Fred Wilz, Latham's general manager of breeding. How are you today, Fred?
Doing well.
Good. Corn breeding is something that a lot of people just think it's as simple as crossing a male and a female, and poof, we have a brand new hybrid that's going to yield 5 bushels more than what we've had in the past. What is it about breeding that you want people to know?
Well, you're right. Breeding's perceived by whoever the person's looking at it, and their minds are relatively set on that notion, like most people are on topics. But breeding is very widespread. So if you're a customer of Latham, you think of breeding as I'm getting, to your point, that hybrid. I'm crossing. So they cross this by this to give me something special. If you look at within the sales force and product development of Latham, they look at it. Okay, what is coming from down the pipeline that's new, that's going to be in the system? Once again, still talking about hybrids. This female crossed by this male, a trait package, what have you. So, and then for us breeding nerds down in the third category, it's really the development of this material. And I say that loosely. We develop the genetics, so we're taking what's out there and trying to improve upon what's there, and also looking into the future, what we would need, and think of that. So it's really about what's the best way of looking at it? I guess you eat a hamburger, and it's already done. That's your hybrid. In breeding, we're trying to figure out how to make the best bun, what condiments we need to put on it, and whether we're using a hamburger or maybe a little sausage with a hamburger. It's really developing all the little pieces that make up that hybrid. So that goes on, behind the scenes a lot. People understand it in some ways, but they just, to your point, call it breeding. They really don't look at it that broken out so much.
So this is kind of a two-part question to kind of follow up with what you said. Kind of explain how long the breeding cycle is. I know it's kind of changed as we've gotten better and more advanced techniques have come in. And then obviously you can't breed a hybrid to meet the topic of the day. For example, like tar spot, you just can't come up with a tar spot hybrid overnight. This takes many years. So, how do you develop a hybrid for a specific disease when you're years out?
In a lot of ways, we try to generally create a hybrid. That's the best way of looking at it. What is the best hybrid we can create with the best defense traits, best yield? If you look at developing things, the first thing you have to look at when you're breeding is if you create, let's say 20,000 different inbreds in a given year. And this is, when I say inbreds, these are just, beginning inbreds. They haven't been evaluated yet. And that the whole topic of how we get that 20,000, will take another 20 minutes. So we'll just say we're coming out with 20,000. And after screening them in nurseries as inbreds and looking at them in specific hybrids, at the end of 5 years, if I still have 2 or 3 of those still alive in the testing system, that's almost considered a success. Now,
wow.
It's so so really you take a large number of what you're looking at and dwindle it down very quickly. But to your point, you're also looking at it for certain traits. So if something doesn't make it as a hybrid, in a hybrid combination that we can sell commercially, maybe that inbred we develop can be something that, to your point, has a tar spot resistance. But we put it back in the breeding program to get better yield with it and the tar spot resistance. And then in another 3 years, we would have, that characteristic in an elite product. So,
okay. No, that makes sense. Kind of what you're describing there. So, in your illustrious career, what has changed the most in breeding?
Breeding is like the game of golf. The game hasn't changed. But what has changed is In golf, you have better golf balls,
Right.
better clubs, get a golf cart to drive around in for us old people. So back when I was a kid, I walked a lot. But the game hasn't changed. It's everything that goes into the game. Now look at corn breeding. When I started back in the early 90s, think of back then, computers had just really gotten popular in the breeding programs. You just had a basic tractor. I mean, this is simple things. And now you go 30 years later and see what you have. And now you have all the DNA technologies that you use. I mean, that was something that was not around or just beginning to come around in the 90s. So the tools we have available for breeding have enhanced it, have sped it up, and made it really more directed. You can go a direction now because you can analyze the DNA of each inbred and or hybrid and say it either has what I want or it doesn't have what I want. And then now you have fine-tuned breeding programs. So yeah, really, it's all the tools we have available for breeding over the last 30 years that have really, I want to say, sped up the program and made it more, I guess, as some of the other stuff I talked about earlier in the summer, analytical.
I mean, to speed that up, I know obviously, there's, and most everybody knows there's the contra season. So we utilize winter nurseries. How fast can you get through a breeding cycle in a year now? Is it just 2? Is it 3?
It depends on the maturity of lines, but most lines, if we can put it in 3 different breeding nurseries throughout the year, that can't be in the United States. That's to your point. We're sending it to other countries, in their summer seasons, and you're sending it to specific environments that don't necessarily grow corn, but they have the right environment to have a sped up season. So it's weird where you see corn growing now. I mean, you could go to a place, there's a place in Chile where you're at a high elevation, there's no water, and it's one of the best corn growing regions for doing breeding nurseries. I mean, who would have guessed that 20 years ago?
What makes it so special, Fred?
It just it has the right environment to be growing that corn in the sequence of your growing seasons. It fits the recipe fine. So you're coming out of maybe a winter nursery in Chile, so that's from November, so say October to January. And then when you harvest that, you can take it right away to this nursery up in the mountains, and it gets planted and gets harvested, we'll say maybe by the end of May. And then you're putting it once again in a summer nursery, or, maybe back in the States or in a greenhouse or somewhere else. There's just so many different combinations you can play with now. It's not the same as it was 30 years ago. I'm going to go Iowa this year, or summer in Iowa, winter in Puerto Rico or something like that. It's really come to the point, where you can grow things at, the optimum times to grow that material. So now you just put together a schedule that gets you as many, as you put it, as many breeding cycles or nurseries as you can get in a year. And for the most part, you can get 3 now.
3. Oh, we have come a long ways. Can you just, without delving into specifics, can you kind of give the listeners an idea of where Latham does our winter testing and winter breeding work?
Well, it makes, mainly it's Mexico, but as we've gotten into some of what we call the dihaploid projects, those tend to do better in South America. So in Chile, if we're playing with traits, then you're kind of limited. So we're doing some work in Hawaii because there's no restrictions there. And we're going to start doing some things in Chile because you're able to, it's a lot of regulatory, but right. It can be down there. And once again, by using Chile, it allows us to get into those accelerated breeding cycles.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned here something just a second ago that I'm not sure how familiar our listeners are to this. Can you give the Reader's Digest version of what dihaploids are?
Reader Digest condensed version. Basically, it's a way, they call it, it's an instant inbred. So the process is taking, when you first develop an inbred, you create what they call populations. So you bring in 2 or 3 similar parents from the similar genetic backgrounds and cross them together, and then we call breed or self out of it, and that can take that takes 7 generations of selfing to get to a fixed inbred.
Wow.
Dihaploids are taking that same population and using their dihaploid process, which I'm not going to get into, but within 2 seasons, you have what we call an instant inbred. So basically, instead of, if you know genetics, they're just taking 1/2 of the chromosomes and then doing a doubling of it. Whereas in nature, you have the chromosomes mix and then they segregate out. Now you're just saying, we're not letting it segregate. We're just taking 1/2 of it and doubling it. And then at that point, you have a set line, which behaves like any other, pure line you develop out of a pedigree breeding system.
So, I mean, double haploids is obviously something that wasn't around, maybe many years ago in full use. What would you consider the biggest breakthrough that you've seen in your career as far as corn breeding goes?
It's really double haploids, because you say it hasn't been around, but it's been around since about 1960. And really, and in my breeding life, every 5 to 8 years, it kind of makes a cycle where it's popular again. What really led to dihaploids taking off is all the genetic marker work you can do now. Now you can drive a population in a direction. You can do a lot more things. In the past, you just had these instant inbreds, and now you're testing them like you did the rest of your breeding program. And now with the markers, you can say, once again, here's the biggest difference. In a breeding population, things are segging. In a dihaploid population, once double that the chromosomes, it's a set line. So any marker work you do is valid. So you can say, does it have this trait or not? Whereas in the other population, it might have that trait, but it might work its way out as you self it more. So, it really, excuse me, it's the refining of all the processes I started with in the 90s that have really made breeding different. And you can say that for about anything. So it's like I said, it's like golf. The game hasn't changed. We've just gotten the better golf clubs. We got the better balls. I mean, that's really what the difference, because but what makes Latham different, and I'm not saying we're the only ones that do it. Some people have taken the process of looking at it scientifically. So analytics again, driving something one way, looking at your lab numbers, looking at that type of information. At Latham, we still believe in the side of breeding of observation. I mean, you have to look at something and know it works. My favorite joke is in the 90s, we were doing BT conversions, and the lab would call us from Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm down in Puerto Rico, saying rows 1, 7, and 8 are your best, inbred line. It has that BT in it that looks like the original line. And you go out there and say, it looks nothing like the original line. So the power of observation, it still is very important in breeding. I think that's what, we talk about gene optics and things like that. Those are things that, are part of that. And we feel are real important. We feel have been left behind by some of the larger companies who are just driving populations, driving new hybrids. We're trying to cater new hybrids into our footprint. And that makes a different look, because we're not a nationwide chain. We're not trying to sell the same hamburger across everywhere. We're trying to make the best tenderloin for this area, or, and get the best sandwich or the best hybrid. So there's 2 different ways of looking at it, but I think we can be successful in what we're doing here at Latham High-Tech Seeds to get it done.
No, that makes total sense. I mean, that's a great analogy. Kind of here to close things out, where do you see it going in the future? What's coming up? What's in the Fred Wilz crystal ball that's coming up in corn breeding throughout the rest of the 20s and into the 30s?
I really hope that we see a renaissance of breeding. When I started breeding, there's a lot of companies and even universities in corn breeding.
Oh.
And today there isn't. I mean, in a former life, we had a small breeding company, and we considered ourselves small. But by the time we sold our breeding company. It was one of the largest independent breeding companies. We didn't get bigger in size. Everybody else got bought up and went away. So I hope the independence in breeding comes back. There's some factors out there now that maybe can lead to this happening, because if not, you really only have, a few players in the game, developing things. And you don't necessarily have to have traits. You have to have genetics first. So if at Latham we can have strong, you know, elite genetics, that puts us one step above anybody else that's kind of not doing something like that. And breeding gains you independence and or some level of independence. So if you give away your independence, you're just kind of flying in the wind. So I hope we see a resurgence of smaller groups taking up some of this breeding, some collaborations within those groups, and really you get back to what you were. As much as you hate going back in time, some of the things we did 30 years ago with working with other companies, it's kind of like today's, I'll bring it up because people hate this, but it's kind of like our political climate. You have yes or no, you don't have anything between. When we have everything in between in breeding, where people are working together, we had more accomplishments and better help for the farmers than if you have it in a few hands dictating how it gets out. So that was a long answer.
No, that's a great point, Fred. How much collaboration is there in the seed industry? Because I think a lot of people have that complete idea that everybody deals with their own set of material. People don't talk between groups, don't exchange material. It's more common than what people think, isn't it?
Yeah, there's even at the upper levels, with traits and stuff, there's some collaboration, but the restrictions they create with that collaboration kind of make it interesting. I think that's one of our strengths here. What we're doing at Latham is we want to find people, and not just people or groups that are similar to us. You want to bring that synergy together of these groups that, this group has something that they can bring along and we have this. And if we do stuff together, then it really makes sense for both of us. And I think there's enough seed companies out there that kind of see it that way, or at least are starting to see it that way. And if they can get into doing something with breeding or testing, I think that it'll fit what we're doing. And then, like I said, not all of these collaborations come together, but our history of breeding has always been working with other companies. So, the group here at Latham's using that same philosophy of trying to find people with like minds to get stuff done.
Right. No, good. Well, and with that, we hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Proof Points, and thank you, and can't wait to see you next week.